Most people think they know the story of the Hemi engine. You've heard about the legendary power, the NASCAR domination, and how it became the most feared engine in racing. But what you didn't know is that the 1964 Hemi was so radical, so different, and so controversial that it nearly destroyed Chrysler's racing program before it even started. In the next few minutes, you'll discover 20 weird facts about the 426 Hemi that even die-hard Mopar fans have never heard, including one that involves a secret government contract that could have changed automotive history forever. The elephant engine nickname wasn't about size, it was about fear. When mechanics first saw the 426 Hemi in 1964, they didn't call it the elephant because it was big. Sure, it weighed about 67 pounds more than the same size 426 Wedge engine, but that wasn't the real reason. The nickname came from the sound it made when it fired up. One Chrysler engineer described it as sounding like an angry elephant trumpeting. The deep, guttural roar was unlike anything else on the track. NASCAR crew chiefs would literally feel the ground shake when a Hemi-powered car rolled by in the pits. The vibration was so intense that tools would fall off workbenches. But here's what's really wild. The engine earned its nickname during secret testing at Chrysler's Chelsea Proving Grounds in late 1963. Test drivers reported that when they hit full throttle, the engine note was so distinctive that security guards a mile away could identify it without seeing the car. Chrysler actually had to build special sound barriers around their test track because local residents complained about what they described as jungle noises coming from the facility at night. The company told concerned neighbors they were testing new industrial equipment, but the truth was they were unleashing the elephant. The first Hemi engines weren't even supposed to exist in 1964. Chrysler's board of directors had actually voted against developing the engine in early 1963, citing cost concerns. But a group of rebel engineers, led by Tom Hoover, continued working on the project in secret. They called it Project X426 and hid the development costs in other budget lines. When they finally revealed the working prototype to management, it was too late to stop. The engine was already winning. Built to win fast, the entire project went from paper to Daytona in 4 months. The timeline for the 1964 Hemi development was absolutely insane. Chrysler officially green-lit the project in October 1963, and by February 1964, the engine was sweeping the Daytona 500. That's just 4 months from approval to total domination. To put that in perspective, most automakers take 3 to 4 years to develop a new engine. Chrysler did it in 120 days. How did they pull this off? The answer involves some serious rule bending. Tom Hoover and his team worked 20-hour days, 7 days a week. They literally slept in the engine lab, taking turns on a cot they set up next to the dynamometer. But the real secret was that they had been secretly developing the basic design for over a year before getting approval. When management finally said yes, they already had most of the engineering complete. The pressure was incredible. Chrysler had been getting destroyed by Ford in NASCAR, and company president Lynn Townsend made it clear that failure wasn't an option. He reportedly told Hoover that if the Hemi didn't win at Daytona, the entire racing program would be canceled. No pressure, right? The team was so stressed that 3 engineers ended up in the hospital with exhaustion before the project was complete. But when Richard Petty led that 1-2-3 sweep at Daytona, leading 184 of 200 laps, all that suffering paid off. Ford's racing director Leo Beebe was so shocked by the Hemi's dominance that he accused Chrysler of cheating. They demanded NASCAR tear down the engines, but every single one was legal. The A864 code hid a racing revolution. Most people have never heard of the A864 code, but in 1964, those 4 characters represented the most feared package in drag racing. This wasn't just an engine code, it was Chrysler's nuclear option for the drag strip. The A864 package included the race-spec 426 Hemi, but that was just the beginning. It also came with a list of modifications so extensive that Chrysler needed a 20-page manual just to explain them all. Here's where it gets interesting. The A864 cars weren't built on the regular assembly line. Instead, Chrysler pulled incomplete cars off the line and sent them to a secret facility in Detroit where a hand-picked team of technicians performed the modifications. These guys were sworn to secrecy and weren't even allowed to tell their families what they were working on. The modifications were so radical that the cars were barely street legal. They removed the heater, radio, and even the rear seats. The doors were replaced with aluminum units that were so thin you could dent them with your finger. But the craziest part? Only about 55 Dodge 330 A864 Superstock lightweight cars were built in 1964. Each one was essentially hand-assembled, and no two were exactly alike. The technicians would make small adjustments based on who was buying the car and what track they planned to race at. If you were racing at sea level, you got different carburetor jetting than someone racing in Denver. These cars were so specialized that Chrysler actually sent a technician with each car to help the owner set it up properly. Today, finding an original A864 car is like finding a unicorn. When they do come up for sale, they command prices well into six figures. 12.5 to 1 compression meant pump gas would destroy it. The 1964 Race Hemi ran a compression ratio of 12.5 to 1. To understand how radical that was, consider that most high-performance street engines of the era ran around 10 to 1. This wasn't an engine you could just fire up with regular gas from the local filling station. It required aviation fuel or racing gas with an octane rating of at least 103. If you tried to run it on pump gas, the engine would literally destroy itself within minutes. The high compression created some interesting challenges. For one thing, the engine was nearly impossible to start when cold. Mechanics had to use a special starting procedure that involved heating the engine block with external heaters for at least 30 minutes before attempting to fire it up. Even then, it would often backfire so violently that it would blow the air cleaners off the carburetors. One Chrysler engineer recalled watching a mechanic get knocked unconscious when a backfire sent an air cleaner into his head. The compression was so high that the pistons actually came within 0.05 inches of hitting the valves. That's about the thickness of a human hair. Any mistake in valve timing, and you'd have bent valves and destroyed pistons. But when everything was set up correctly, the power was unbelievable. The engine produced around 425 horsepower in race trim, but some teams claimed they were seeing close to 500 horsepower with special tuning. Remember, this was in an era when most V8s were making 200 to 300 horsepower. The Hemi was literally doubling the power output of its competitors. Cross-bolted mains were borrowed from marine engines. The cross-bolted main bearing caps on the 1964 Hemi weren't originally designed for racing. They were actually borrowed from Chrysler's marine engine division. In the late 1950s, Chrysler had developed heavy-duty boat engines that used side bolts to clamp the main bearing caps. The idea was to prevent the crankshaft from walking around under the extreme loads of pushing a heavy boat through water. When Tom Hoover's team was designing the Hemi, they realized they had a similar problem. The engine was making so much power that conventional main bearing caps couldn't handle the stress. During early dyno testing, they actually had a crankshaft break free and punch through the side of the block. The explosion was so violent that it embedded pieces of metal in the concrete wall 20 feet away. That's when someone remembered the marine engine design. But here's the weird part. The crossbolts weren't in the original Hemi design. They were added just 6 weeks before the Daytona 500 when testing revealed the weakness. The team had to completely redesign the block casting and retool the production line in record time. They worked around the clock to get the new blocks cast and machined. The first engines with cross-bolted mains were literally assembled the week before they had to ship to Daytona. Talk about cutting it close. If those marine engineers hadn't developed that technology years earlier, the Hemi might have never made it to the track. The cross-ram intake looked backwards on purpose. When people first saw the cross-ram dual-quad intake on the 1964 race Hemi, they thought Chrysler had installed it backwards. The carburetors sat at opposite angles, with the throttle linkage crossing over in an X pattern that looked completely wrong. But this bizarre design was actually a stroke of genius that gave the Hemi a huge advantage over its competitors. The cross-ram design was based on a principle called tuned intake runner length. By crossing the intake runners, Chrysler engineers could make them longer without making the engine taller. The long runners created a ram effect that literally shoved more air into the cylinders at certain RPM ranges. It was like having a primitive form of supercharging without any moving parts. The design was so effective that it added about 30 horsepower over a conventional dual-quad setup. But the real genius was in the details. The intake was cast from aluminum to save weight, and the internal passages were hand-ported by specialists who spent up to 40 hours on each manifold. They used special tools to create specific turbulence patterns that improved fuel atomization. Some of these specialists could feel imperfections in the ports that were invisible to the naked eye. Chrysler was so protective of this technology that they welded the manifolds shut after assembly so competitors couldn't copy the internal design. When NASCAR officials demanded to inspect the intakes, Chrysler had to cut them open and then re-weld them afterwards. The process was so complex that they actually destroyed several manifolds just trying to satisfy the inspectors. Iron heads in '64 because aluminum kept cracking. Everyone associates the race Hemi with aluminum heads. But the 1964 engines actually used cast iron. This wasn't because Chrysler was being cheap or old-fashioned. They desperately wanted to use aluminum heads for the weight savings, but they kept cracking during testing. The problem was so severe that they went through over 200 prototype aluminum heads before giving up. The issue came down to the extreme temperatures and pressures inside the combustion chambers. The 12.5-to-1 compression ratio created peak pressures over 1,000 pounds per square inch. Combined with exhaust temperatures that could exceed 1,500 degrees, the aluminum heads would develop hairline cracks after just a few hours of racing. One test engine actually had a head completely separate from the block during a full throttle run, launching it through the hood and into the air. The test driver said it looked like a UFO flying past his window. So Chrysler bit the bullet and used iron heads for 1964. But they didn't just use regular cast iron. These heads were made from a special high nickel alloy that was normally reserved for diesel truck engines. The casting process was so precise that they had to maintain the foundry temperature within 2 degrees for the entire pour. Any variation would create weak spots that could fail under racing conditions. The iron heads added about 40 pounds to the engine, but they were virtually indestructible. Some teams ran the same heads for an entire season without any failures. It wasn't until 1965 that Chrysler finally figured out how to make aluminum heads that could survive the punishment. Banned after 1 season for being too good. The 1964 season was both the Hemi's greatest triumph and its biggest disaster. After dominating NASCAR and drag racing all year, the engine was banned for 1965. NASCAR's excuse was that the Hemi wasn't available in production cars, making it illegal under their new rules. But everyone knew the real reason was that Ford and General Motors had pressured NASCAR to level the playing field. The ban was devastating for Chrysler. They had spent millions developing the Hemi, only to have it sidelined after 1 season. Richard Petty, who had won the championship with the Hemi, was so angry that he temporarily switched to drag racing. Chrysler actually pulled out of NASCAR completely for most of 1965 in protest. The company estimated they lost over $10 million in marketing value from the ban. But here's the part most people don't know. The ban actually saved the Hemi. Because Chrysler couldn't race it, they were forced to develop a street version to get it homologated for 1966. This led to the legendary street Hemi that would become one of the most valuable engines in automotive history. If NASCAR hadn't banned the race engine, Chrysler might never have built the street version. Sometimes getting kicked out of the party is the best thing that can happen to you. The ban also forced Chrysler to get creative with their racing program, leading to innovations that would dominate motorsports for the next decade. Have you ever seen one of these original race Hemis in person? They're incredibly rare today. Let me know in the comments if you've ever encountered one of these legendary engines, wet or dry sump oiling depending on the race. One of the most unusual features of the 1964 race Hemi was that it could be configured with either wet sump or dry sump oiling systems. This wasn't common in 1964. Most racing engines used one system or the other, but the Hemi was designed to be adaptable. The choice depended on what kind of racing you were doing. For drag racing, teams usually stuck with the wet sump system. It was simpler, lighter, and perfectly adequate for straight-line acceleration. But for NASCAR and endurance racing, the dry sump system was essential. The problem with wet sump oiling on a banked track was that centrifugal force would push all the oil to one side of the pan. Engines were literally starving for oil while going around the high banks at Daytona. Early testing showed that oil pressure would drop to zero in the turns, causing catastrophic engine failures. The dry sump system used an external oil tank and multiple scavenge pumps to ensure constant oil pressure. But here's what's really interesting. Chrysler's dry sump system was unlike anything else being used at the time. Instead of mounting the oil tank in the trunk like everyone else, they integrated it into the car's frame rail. This kept the weight low and centered, improving handling. The system was so complex that it required 17 different oil lines, and a special technician had to travel with the cars to maintain it. One wrong connection, and you'd pump all your oil onto the track. But when it worked properly, it gave the Hemi-powered cars a huge reliability advantage in long races. Tom Hoover's baby almost got him fired twice. Tom Hoover, known as the godfather of the 426 Hemi, nearly lost his job twice while developing the engine. The first time was in early 1963 when upper management discovered he was secretly working on the project without authorization. He had been using company resources and personnel to develop what was supposed to be a canceled program. When the CEO found out, he called Hoover into his office for what everyone assumed would be his termination. But Hoover came prepared. He had brought dyno sheets showing that his prototype engine was making over 400 horsepower, nearly 100 horsepower more than Ford's best racing engine. He also had a cost analysis showing that the Hemi program would pay for itself in marketing value within 2 years. The CEO was so impressed that instead of firing Hoover, he gave him a bigger budget and told him to have the engine ready for Daytona. The second near firing came just weeks before the 1964 Daytona 500. During a critical test session, one of the prototype engines exploded so violently that it caused over $100,000 in damage to Chrysler's newest dyno facility. That's equivalent to over $1 million today. The explosion was caused by an experimental fuel mixture that Hoover had been testing without proper authorization. Company lawyers wanted him fired for the safety violation, but the racing program's success saved him again. By then, everyone knew the Hemi was going to be special. Hoover went on to lead Chrysler's performance division for another 20 years, but he always said those were the closest calls of his career. Ramcharger's fingerprints shaped every detail. The Ramchargers weren't just another racing team, they were Chrysler engineers who raced on weekends. This unique situation meant that the 1964 Hemi was literally designed by the people who would race it. The group included engineers from every department: engine design, transmission, suspension, and aerodynamics. They would race on Sunday, meet on Monday to discuss what broke, and have fixes designed by Friday. Their influence on the Hemi was enormous. For example, the unusual valve angle of the Hemi heads came from a Ramcharger suggestion. They had noticed that their modified Wedge engines made more power when they accidentally installed a head gasket that tilted the valves. This led to months of testing different valve angles until they found the optimal configuration. The final design used a valve angle that was so unusual, special tools had to be created just to work on the heads. But their biggest contribution might have been in reliability testing. The Ram Chargers would intentionally abuse the engines to find weak points. They called it destruction testing. They would run engines at redline for hours, use the wrong oil, ignore maintenance schedules, anything to make them fail. One test involved running an engine at 9,000 RPM until it exploded. It took 6 hours. The crankshaft finally exited through the oil pan, but the heads and block were still intact. This kind of real-world testing was invaluable in making the production engines bulletproof. Every failure led to a design improvement that made it into the final product. Blueprint for decades of nitro domination. What most people don't realize is that the 1964 Hemi became the foundation for every top fuel and funny car engine used in NHRA for the next 60 years. The basic architecture, the bore spacing, the valve angles, even the bolt patterns, all trace back to that original design. It's like Chrysler accidentally created the DNA for all future nitro racing. The evolution was gradual at first. Racers started with stock 426 blocks and added aftermarket parts. Then specialty companies like Keith Black and Donovan began making aluminum blocks based on the Hemi design. By the 1970s, these engines were making over 2,000 horsepower on nitromethane. Today's 11,000 horsepower top fuel engines are still essentially 1964 Hemis on steroids. They use the same bore centers, the same basic head design, and even some of the same dimensions. This longevity is unprecedented in racing. No other engine design has remained competitive for 6 decades. When Chrysler engineers were designing the Hemi in 1963, they had no idea they were creating something that would still be winning races in the 21st century. Tom Hoover once said that if he had known the engine would last this long, he would have charged more for the patent rights. But Chrysler's decision to make the design available to aftermarket companies ensured its survival. Every time a top fuel car runs down the quarter mile today, it's using technology that was hammered out in a Detroit workshop over 60 years ago. Ford Streak Stopper changed NASCAR forever. Before the Hemi showed up at Daytona in February 1964, Ford had won every 500-mile NASCAR race for 2 straight seasons. They were so dominant that some teams were considering switching manufacturers. The sport was in danger of becoming a Ford parade. Then came that fateful Sunday when Richard Petty's Hemi-powered Plymouth led a Chrysler sweep that shocked the racing world. The psychological impact was immediate. Ford's team manager reportedly threw his clipboard through a window when he saw the Chrysler cars running away from his best drivers. The Blue Oval boys had brought their latest 427 engines, convinced they would extend their winning streak. Instead, they watched helplessly as the Hemis pulled away like they were standing still. Petty was lapping the field so quickly that NASCAR officials thought their timing equipment was malfunctioning. But here's what really changed. The Hemi's dominance forced every manufacturer to step up their game. Within months, Ford was developing the SOHC 427, and Chevrolet was working on the Mystery Motor 427. The Hemi had started an all-out horsepower war that would define NASCAR for the next decade. It also changed how teams approached racing. Before the Hemi, most teams focused on handling and driver skill. After Daytona 64, raw power became the priority. The sport would never be the same. Secret government contract almost militarized the Hemi. Here's a fact that's been buried in classified documents for decades. The U.S. military almost adopted the 426 Hemi for combat vehicles in 1964. The Army was looking for a new engine for their experimental high-speed reconnaissance vehicles, and the Hemi's power-to-weight ratio caught their attention. Chrysler was asked to submit a proposal for a military-spec version of the racing engine. The military version would have been different from the race engine in several ways. It needed to run on standard military fuel, which meant lowering the compression ratio. It also needed to be waterproof for river crossings and capable of running at extreme angles for hill climbing. Chrysler's engineers spent 3 months developing prototypes that met these requirements. They even created a special air filtration system that could handle desert sand without clogging. The project got as far as field testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. 3 prototype vehicles powered by military Hemis were put through combat simulations. The engines performed beyond expectations, allowing the vehicles to reach speeds over 90 miles per hour on rough terrain. But the project was suddenly canceled in December 1964. The official reason was budget constraints, but insiders suspected that Ford's political connections had influenced the decision. They had their own engine in development and didn't want Chrysler to get the contract. Those 3 military Hemi prototypes disappeared into a warehouse somewhere, and their fate remains unknown. Some collectors believe they still exist, waiting to be discovered. The real reason it weighed more shocked engineers. Everyone knew the Hemi was heavier than the Wedge engine it replaced, but the reason why remained a mystery for years. Most people assumed it was because of the massive heads or the reinforced block. But when engineers finally did a detailed analysis, they discovered something unexpected. The extra weight wasn't where they thought it would be. The biggest weight gain came from the valve train. The Hemi's rocker arm system was incredibly complex compared to a conventional engine. Each cylinder had its own rocker shaft, supported by massive pedestals cast into the head. The rocker arms themselves were forged from special steel that was twice as heavy as standard rockers. Just the valve train components added 35 pounds to the engine. But this weight was necessary to handle the extreme valve spring pressures and high RPM operation. Another surprise was the oiling system. The Hemi had almost twice as many oil passages as a Wedge engine. These passages were drilled through solid, cast iron, creating a network of channels that looked like Swiss cheese inside the block. The extra iron needed to support these passages added another 20 pounds. Chrysler engineers joked that they were building a mobile oil refinery, not an engine. But all that extra weight paid off in durability. While Ford's lightweight engines were failing after a few races, the Hemis could run an entire season with just basic maintenance. Stress-relieved blocks using Aerospace technology. The stress-relieving process used on 1964 Hemi blocks was borrowed directly from the aerospace industry. Chrysler had been working with NASA on rocket engine components, and they learned about a heat treatment process that could prevent metal fatigue. They decided to try it on the Hemi blocks, making them the first automotive engines to use this space-age technology. The process was incredibly complex. After casting, each block was placed in a special oven and heated to exactly 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature was then slowly reduced over a period of 24 hours, following a precise curve. Any deviation from this curve would ruin the block. The ovens were so sophisticated that they cost more than most houses. Chrysler had to build a dedicated facility just for this process. But here's what's really fascinating. The stress relieving changed the molecular structure of the iron. It aligned the grain patterns in a way that distributed stress evenly throughout the block. This meant that instead of developing cracks at weak points, the entire block would flex uniformly under load. Racing teams reported that stress-relieved blocks could handle 50% more power than standard blocks without failing. The technology was so effective that Chrysler kept the exact process secret for years. Competitors tried to reverse engineer it, but could never match the durability of the factory blocks. Daytona engines built by just 6 men. The engines that dominated the 1964 Daytona 500 weren't built on an assembly line. They were hand-assembled by a team of just 6 men in a locked room at Chrysler's engine plant. These weren't ordinary assembly workers. They were the best engine builders in the company, hand-picked by Tom Hoover himself. Each man had at least 10 years of experience building racing engines. The team worked in absolute secrecy. They entered through a separate entrance and weren't allowed to talk to other workers about what they were doing. The room was off limits to everyone except those 6 men and Tom Hoover. Even plant management needed special permission to enter. The security was so tight because Chrysler was paranoid about Ford or GM spies learning their secrets. Each engine took approximately 40 hours to build. Every component was measured, balanced, and blueprinted to exact specifications. The builders used micrometers to check tolerances that were tighter than anything in production cars. They would spend hours adjusting valve lash to get it perfect, sometimes dismantling an entire engine because one measurement was off by 0.02 of an inch. These 6 men built all the race engines for Chrysler's factory teams in 1964. Their signature was so distinctive that experienced mechanics could tell which builder had assembled an engine just by how it sounded. When these builders retired, Chrysler found it impossible to match their skill level. The company eventually had to develop new assembly techniques because no one could replicate what those 6 craftsmen did by hand. Dual carbs synced with guitar tuning forks, the dual 4-barrel carburetors on the cross-ram intake required perfect synchronization to work properly. But in 1964, there were no electronic tools to measure airflow. Chrysler engineers came up with an ingenious solution that sounds like something from a mad scientist's laboratory. They used guitar tuning forks to synchronize the carburetors. Here's how it worked. A mechanic would hold a specific tuning fork near each carburetor throat while the engine was running. The airflow would cause the fork to vibrate at a certain frequency. By adjusting the carburetor until both forks vibrated at exactly the same pitch, they could achieve perfect synchronization. The technique was so precise that it became standard procedure for all Chrysler racing teams. But it gets weirder. Different tracks required different synchronization because of altitude and air density changes. Teams carried sets of tuning forks calibrated for different conditions. A fork that worked at Daytona wouldn't give the right reading at Darlington. Some crew chiefs could sync carburetors by ear, claiming they could hear when the airflow was perfect. They called it carburetor whispering. Modern racers using electronic sensors have confirmed that the tuning fork method was accurate to within 2%, which is remarkable for such a primitive technique. Today, original Hemi tuning fork sets are valuable collectibles, with complete sets selling for thousands of dollars. The surprise engine that changed everything, and the surprise engine I promised you at the beginning, is the one-of-a-kind aluminum block Hemi that Chrysler built for the 1965 Indianapolis 500. While everyone knows about the Iron Race Hemis, almost nobody knows that Chrysler secretly developed a full aluminum version that weighed 120 pounds less than the standard engine. This wasn't just aluminum heads on an iron block. This was a complete aluminum engine that was decades ahead of its time. The Indy Hemi project was so secret that only a handful of people at Chrysler knew it existed. They built exactly 3 engines in a hidden workshop at the proving grounds. The aluminum block used steel cylinder liners and special reinforcements around the main bearings. It made the same power as the iron version, but in a package that was revolutionary for 1965. The plan was to dominate Indy and then use that success to market a whole new generation of lightweight Hemis. But here's where it gets interesting. During qualifying for the 1965 Indy 500, one of the aluminum Hemis was installed in a radical rear-engine car. In practice, it was running lap times that would have easily put it on pole position. Then mysteriously, Chrysler withdrew the entry just days before the race. The official story was technical problems, but insiders claim that Ford threatened to expose some of Chrysler's NASCAR rule bending if they ran the aluminum engine at Indy. The 3 aluminum Hemis were supposedly destroyed, but rumors persist that at least one survived and is hidden in a private collection. If true, it would be the holy grail of Hemi engines, worth more than most people's houses. Mac's Wedge sunset came suddenly when Hemi arrived. The 426 Mac's Wedge had been Chrysler's top dog for just 2 years when the Hemi arrived in 1964. But the transition wasn't smooth. Mac's Wedge owners suddenly found themselves with obsolete engines that couldn't compete with the new Hemis. Some racers had just spent thousands of dollars on Mac's Wedge cars, only to watch them get destroyed by the Hemi-powered competition. Chrysler tried to soften the blow by offering upgrade kits to Mac's Wedge owners, but it was like putting a bandage on a severed limb. The Hemi was so superior that no amount of modification could make a Mac's Wedge competitive. This created a lot of bad blood between Chrysler and some of their most loyal racers. Several prominent teams actually switched to Ford in protest, feeling betrayed by Chrysler's sudden abandonment of the Mac's Wedge program. But here's what most people don't know. Chrysler continued to secretly support Mac's Wedge racers through 1964. They provided special parts and technical support to keep these customers happy while they transitioned to Hemis. Some Mac's Wedge engines received experimental parts that were never officially cataloged. These Super Mac's Wedges could almost match a stock Hemi in performance, but they required constant maintenance and exotic fuel. By the end of 1964, almost everyone had switched to Hemis, and the Mac's Wedge faded into history. Today, those final evolution Mac's Wedge engines are incredibly rare and valuable, representing the end of an era in Chrysler performance. That's all for today, folks. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button so you don't miss the next one. See you there.